Hi, Mary. It's such an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. In fact, I asked Ted if I could interview you because I've admired your work for so long. So thank you for taking some time with us.
I'm really happy to be with you. Thank you.
And congratulations on this new book, which I understand you weren't planning on writing. So I would love to talk with you about what inspired you at this stage, uh, after all you've written, how many books you've written, that you would write your memoir. What prompted it?
Well, thank you for that question. I think this is my 12th book. It sort of depends on how we count. But I hadn't planned to write another book. I developed an interest in other things and was ready to not work in publishing and deal with the stress of deadlines. What happened was the pandemic. And at that point, I went into a very dark time. I couldn't see my children or my grandchildren. I couldn't see my friends. My husband's a musician in 5 bands, and I was used to a lot of music and dancing, and that was over for me. So as I struggled with my own darkness and despair, I decided, I have some skills. I know about the right attitude to have to find light. Let me go back through my own life and remember the darkness and remember the light. So that's what inspired me. I also needed a project. I needed a way to wake every morning and feel I could be helpful and useful. When I was a therapist, Lisa, I really enjoyed every day waking up with the idea I'm going to help somebody. I'm going to make someone feel better. And as an author, that's what I've enjoyed too. Yeah. I like the idea that something I write can be of use. And what I hoped with this book was, as I struggled to find my way to the light, I would be able to share something with readers that helped them find the light too. So it was actually really wonderful I had this book. It kept me busy and hopeful during a very dark time.
I just last week taught my first ever memoir writing workshop, and it was geared toward non-memoirists. So, of course, thinking about yours, which I had just finished reading, and sitting in a room full of people, all 50 plus, usually it's the 50 plus who start thinking about reflecting on their lives. I loved what you taught, and it was an incredibly moving experience that I'm sure you feel as both an author and having been a therapist for so long, of helping people work through their various particular issues. So it must be so exciting for you to know that you've touched so many people, going way back to your first book, and the conversations you had, was that 25, 30 years ago, about young women. Now here we are, older women. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about reflecting on the female experience of life and the arc of life from youth to older times, how you're making sense of that. You talk about this in all your work, but how do we make sense of the aging process, and how we as women find our way in the world?
Well, I believe you're mentioning Reviving Ophelia, which yes. I wrote over 25 years ago. My daughter and I actually brought out a 25th year anniversary edition of Reviving Ophelia a couple years ago. And we did new research, caught up with the reading, had some focus groups. We sent out the old book around the country and asked girls to cross out everything that was no longer relevant, and then to write in the margins what they wanted us to discuss. And that was actually a very good research tool for us in terms of orienting toward life in 2018 as opposed to, or 2020 as opposed to 1994. But anyway, I very much am interested in women. I taught the first psychology of women class at the University of Nebraska. I taught sex roles and gender. And I have great love and respect for women. I've been very lucky in my own life. My mother, my grandmothers, my aunts were all people who were wonderful and important to me. And influential in terms of how I developed a point of view on the universe. And then I write in the new book, A Life in Light, about my first good friend and how important it was to have a seventh grade friend named Jeannie, who I talked to and giggled with and processed my life with. And it was really the first time I'd had someone outside my own family that helped me see myself as independent from my family and able to have a separate and more differentiated self. So that was a wonderful experience. It was also a time I felt deeply heard and nurtured. And that's been a continuing experience of mine, Lisa, with women all of my life. I've always had a lot of girlfriends and then women friends. Right now, I'm in a group of women writers. We started camping together in 1985 when our kids were little. So we've gone through everything together. We've gone through rocky marriages and kids hitting the school system and difficult teenagers and kids leaving home and parents dying and retirement and menopause, cranky year or two for us when we were all going through menopause. And so women friends have been very important to me. I've really enjoyed looking at women as they age, because in my opinion, so many women as they age become just these wonderful, vivacious, engaged people that are rich in relationships, rich in experience. They're a combination of sensible and idealistic, spiritual and practical. And for me, they're the most nurturing people in my lives. I mean, I have a good husband and good children, but women friends are historically the people all my life who've taken care of me.
And the celebration of women in Women Rowing North, your book before this one, obviously is clear and clear. Obviously resonated for so many people, that celebration, as opposed to that put someone off on a shelf. Those women, those older women need to go off on a shelf. You found a way to celebrate women as they get older, which is, we're grateful to you for that.
Well, you know, there's a kind of a bookend thing, because with Reviving Ophelia, I was saying that the cultural ideas about teenage girls are poison to teenage girls and do nothing but interfere with their healthy development into productive, strong people. And by the way, that's as true today as it was when I wrote the book in 94, if not more true.
Right.
And the same thing happens again with older women. We're expected to be complainers and naggers. There's a great deal of ageist, sexist joking about older women. And the stereotypes are terrible. And in fact, that's what always motivated me to write, the difference between the cultural story and real lived experience. And I knew, because I was around so many older women, that these cultural scripts are a very bad fit. So
I was rereading parts of Women Rowing North this morning, and I loved what you said about wisdom being the capacity to skillfully select our narratives. When we do this, we experience our lives as filled with meaning. Every present day event resonates with the decades of past events. I mean, that's certainly a theme in why you just described why you've written this memoir and much of your work about writing about Buddhism. It is sort of the essence of Buddhism, isn't it? And I just wanted to ask you about this coping mechanism that you've talked about story, how important story and retelling of stories and shaping of stories is for anybody watching this who may not be familiar with your work. And even if they are, I'd love to hear your summary of that, because it is so essential.
Well, first of all, I have always been a big storyteller, and I forget which book I wrote this in, but I used to hang out the clothes for my family. And as I hung two socks together, I'd name them and make up a story. I could make up a story that fast. And I was the neighborhood storyteller at night. A lot of children come to our front yard, and we'd lie around in the grass and tell stories. So stories have always been a big part of my life. Not written stories, because I didn't write until I was in my mid-40s. but telling stories and loving to listen to other people's stories. But when I was a therapist, one of the philosophers that very much influenced me was an Australian psychologist named Michael White, who wrote a book called Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends. And he had the hypothesis that many people who are in trouble because they're telling themselves problem-saturated stories. In other words, their lives aren't necessarily better or worse than most people, but they're seeing the darkness, they're repeating to themselves the darkness. So when I saw clients, one of my goals was to help them restory their own lives and craft a more resplendent narrative of who they were and what their experience had been. And it had to do with giving people more lightness in their story, more hope, recognizing their strengths, empowering them to be a more embodied, authentic person in the world. Mm-hmm. So that was part of therapy. And then when I came into writing, which was really my attempt to move what I knew about therapy into the culture, I decided I wanted to write because I felt like I had things to say that would help more than one person at a time. So that's why I started with, my first book was actually Hunger Pains, right. At a time when women knew nothing about eating disorders and there was no material. And I worked with enough women in the 80s in Nebraska. I figured out some things and wrote this little book, Hunger Pains. But with all my books, one of the goals I've had is to tell stories in such a way that people who read them see the possibilities for a fuller, richer self. So that was very much true with, say, Reviving Ophelia or Women Rowing North. And with this last book that I've just written, A Life in Light, one of the things I wanted to do was say, there's always a way to balance joy and despair. There's always a way to do that. There's always a way to take a day and build a better day. There's always a way in a day to find presence and have some glorious moments of presence and gratitude. For example, I think since Uvalde, I started this, but I've really had trouble settling my mind down and being as balanced and steady and calm as I want to be. And for me, the greatest calming skills are the natural world and mindfulness, those two things. So I started, in Nebraska, it's been very hot, and I wake up at 5:30 or 6. So I started going out on a walk every morning around 6 and just breathing and taking in the sound of the birds, the look of the sky, the smell of the grass and the flowers. And after that walk, I felt more balanced and steady. So the book is actually full of times when I was in a dark place and I found a way through energy and attention and eventually skills to move myself to a better place. And I hope that it's just stories. It's just a book of stories, but I hope it has some usefulness to readers who are also, as I think almost all of us are right now, in dark places.
And that's certainly why this New York Times essay that was published concurrent with the release of A Life in Light, I think has resonated for so many people. The last time I looked, there are many, many comments. Many people have recirculated, retweeted the piece because we're all functioning every day. We have to get through the day. And you gave us that beautiful example just now. And in this piece that you wrote about coping with despair while your life is okay, how do you reconcile those two things? And that is really beautiful and powerful and so helpful. So I'm sure you've heard from people directly since that piece was published.
I tried to write about what I'm experiencing. When I connect with readers the most is when I go the deepest into my own heart. Mm-hmm. And that when we get to a certain level of depth, we're all very much alike. And so if I can get to that depth in my writing, I think it does connect with other people. But one of the things I talked about in that New York Times op-ed that was actually in the paper today, it's been online a couple of days, but is the idea of a kind of a double consciousness, that I know how I'm a lucky person, I'm a fortunate person, I have a nice house in a safe neighborhood, I have enough money, I'm all right in terms of so many things other people, I don't take any of that for granted. So many things other people are struggling with. And I can build a good day. I know how to have the right combination of work and play, and I know how to have fun with my friends and listen to music and read a good book and cook a good meal and so on. And I can build a good day with my own skills and energy and choices. But meanwhile, on the horizon, all around a blue sky day, is darkness, these dark, frightening clouds. And so if I stay on that level of I'm having a good day, if I stay as much as I can in the present moment, I can be happy. But if I look further out on the horizon, it's very frightening. And so I think one of the tricks is we can't hide from reality. We have to accept and process at some level this extraordinarily difficult world we're in. And on the other hand, we have a right, even almost a responsibility, to find joy and love in our lives and to be grateful for the gift of existence. So it's a kind of a delicate balancing between the two. And I don't claim to have achieved it. I only claim to have identified it as a situation in my life.
And it clearly is something that has been the case for so many people over the last 6-8 years. And I found myself struggling with how to cope with people who are mired in the bad and incapable or feel incapable of swimming through it. So I think, again, that's why the op-ed and everything you've written really is a totem for so many of us, to give us a sense that there are other people out there who don't want to be mired in the muck, who want to look at what's in front of us and do it and get through and survive, because that's really what it's all about, isn't it? It's helping one another and doing what we can. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that we're heliotropic. Humans are heliotropic. We turn toward the sun naturally. And of course, in dark times and with dark personal situations, it's very easy to get stuck with a problem-saturated story about one's own life. But for example, one of my great heroes is Thich Nhat Hanh, and he saw a tremendous amount of suffering. I mean, one of his close friends burned himself to death on a street to protest the Vietnam War, the American War, as the Vietnamese call it. And yet Thich Nhat Hanh managed to come up with a set of skills to be happy and calm no matter what. And his skills, of course, are all over the world right now. But I think it's possible. And I think most people respond well to delight and enthusiasm and joy and beauty and so on. If they are given an opportunity to see those things. You know, one thing I write about in all of my books, actually, but in this one particularly, is our great capacity for wonder, and how it's very unfortunate if people don't awaken themselves to that, because it's not actually that difficult, but it requires an awareness of that capacity and an eagerness to experience wonder. And if we have that, we're much more likely to have joy in our lives and not be so low. Also, I use wonder as a way to deal with the worst circumstances of my life. For example, when someone I love dies, I'll put on music that just goes right into my soul. And that's when I can weep, is when something is so beautiful that my heart will release itself. And after the first, the school shootings now are common, but after the first one, I think it was in Connecticut.
New York.
Sandy Hook. After Sandy Hook, I was just absolutely stunned by that. I could not imagine a human being exist who would voluntarily hurt children. I just was beyond anything I had ever, of course, I knew about the Nazis, I knew about war, but this was a new concept to me. And I couldn't settle myself down. And so I went outside, it was winter. I went outside with a sleeping bag and lay on my driveway and looked at the stars. And it took the whole night sky to contain my grief and calm me down. But eventually it did. I got cold, but I stayed. And eventually I was all right. I was all right.
It was so many resonant items in your memoir, but how you talk about children and the joy, the natural innate joy that we get from being around children was beautiful. And also beautiful for me was how you articulated your grief when your children grew up and moved away. At one point, you know, they're relocating, and the inability to see them regularly really struck you. And it struck for me how my parents must have felt when I moved away. So I really appreciated how you shared that. But let's talk for a minute about children, because that is, as we get older, it's harder for us to be around children if we don't have them in our homes any longer. But they're natural joy creators because of the wonder that they have. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Well, I've always really loved children. In fact, I wanted to have 10 children. And when I married my husband, he made it very clear he wasn't up for 10 children. So we didn't have 10 children, but I would have been happy. I honestly think if I'd had 10 kids, I would have loved it, you know. But I really enjoyed my own children. I remember when I went to a Target one day when my daughter had outgrown baby clothes, and just looking at baby clothes, I started to cry at the realization I was done. I'd never have a baby again. And then when my grandchildren were young, I would have to say it was the happiest time of my life. I was lucky enough to have 5 grandchildren, and I had a lot of contact with them when they were young. And it was just, I never got over how much fun it was and the miraculousness of my experiences with them. I've got a chapter in the book I could read a few sentences from if we have time, just to share a little bit of the activities I did with the children.
Yes.
But there's a point in this book where, first of all, my older grandchildren have grown up, and 2 of them are in college. One's almost ready for college. And I didn't know they'd do that. I mean, theoretically, I knew it, but emotionally, I didn't realize, oh no, they're going to grow up, go on with their own lives, and I'll become a more peripheral person. They'll love me, but I won't be such an exciting, important person in their life anymore. So that was a shock. And then at the same time, my daughter's family, those boys had lived 2 blocks away. And they were 4 and 8 when my daughter and her husband decided to move to Canada, which is a 16-hour drive. And that was very hard. I've got a chapter in the book called Teardrops in the Snow. And of course, my daughter and her husband have a right to live wherever they want. I didn't live in my mother's hometown. I moved to a town I wanted to live in when I was an adult. But it was very hard. And then it became harder with COVID because the border was closed for 20 months. So that was a very difficult, dark period. And I wrote about it in Teardrops in the Snow. And it colored much of the book in that I'm very much a heat-seeking mammal. I love people around me. I love touching people, hugging people. I like children on my lap. I like making chili for 10 people. And the whole book was influenced by the fact that most of the time I was writing that book, I was walking with a woman friend outside, or I was with my husband in the house. So it was a very different period. Let me find, if you have just a second, let me find a little bit of this chapter, Will They Remember? Do you remember that chapter?
Yes, it's a beautiful, beautiful chapter.
You know, it's actually 4 pages of questions. But I think if I read just a couple of paragraphs, the reader will have a sense for how much I like being around children. And I'd like to say how I conclude that chapter too. Okay. Will my grandchildren remember how when they were babies, I carried them outside to look at the sky and the green, how I tickled their faces with flowers and blue dandelion fluff for them to watch, how I held their hands up against tree bark and fern and dipped their toes in rainwater? Will their bodies recall the back and forth of our ancient wooden rocker, or our afternoons reading books as we swayed in the hammock under the pines? Once I read Kate 26 books, and when I finished, she asked me to do it again. Will the children retain the feel of my arms around them as I carried them about the house, pointing at objects and saying, book, kitty, banana? When they change their own children's diapers, will they sing show tunes to keep them from wriggling away? When they feed their babies, will they call out the rhyme I sang to them? Open your mouth and shut your eyes, and I'll give you something to make you wise. Now, how I conclude that chapter, Lisa, is by saying, I don't think they will remember. I really don't, but I'll remember. And that is one thing, one of the journeys I went through on this book was realizing that all my life I'd been an attachment-seeking organism. I'd looked for love, I'd built relationships. I'm very fortunate. I've lived in the same town since 1972. So by now I have 50 years of friends in this town and a lot of connections through writing and psychology and music and neighbors and so on. So all of my life, I'd built more and more rich and rewarding relationships. And all of a sudden, with the grandchildren gone and the pandemic, I realized my job for the next period of time would be learning to detach and learning to deal with letting go. I had to stop arguing with reality and accept the fact my life would be different. And the great lesson that came out of that for me was realizing I could generate within my own heart the love I needed to survive. It was it's a very important lesson, a very emotional lesson. And of course, I still want people around. I still want my grandchildren around when I can see them. But I also learned I can look within and find that light I need.
That detachment is the essence of Buddhism. And you've written about Buddhism and your interest in it. And I wondered, you came to that recognition of the power of Buddhism and detachment before this stage of your life. So I want to hear more about how you connected to it, because it is so resonant and so evident in all your work, how it's infused your being.
Well, I had a meltdown in 2002. And what it had to do with was I'd been out on the road too many years speaking. I had one year I spent more nights in hotels than my own bed. And I had written a book, Middle of Everywhere, which was really a love song to refugees and diversity. And that book was actually, I sent it off to my editor just before I left for a trip to Canada on September 9th, 2001. And of course, September 11th was 2 days later. And that book became stale overnight. So it was a very hard book to sell. People were not wanting a love song to refugees at that point. They were reading about Islam and thinking about the vulnerability they felt with all of the diversity in the world. LBJ said very beautifully, let's hope the world doesn't grow into a neighborhood before it grows into a brotherhood. And that's really what was happening. We were a neighborhood, but we were not a brotherhood. And it was a very frightening time. But anyway, I felt I really needed to be out trying to help sell that book, both to counter the other messages in the culture against diversity, but also to meet my obligations to my publisher. So I was out on the road after 9/11, working harder than I knew was good for me. And at some point, I had a meltdown. I just realized, actually, it was funny how I knew it. I was in a little restaurant in Ohio on my way to a speech. And I'd been reading Michael Pollan's book, Fast Food Nation. And I ordered a bowl of chili. This wasn't a very clean restaurant. It was no place I would have voluntarily had a meal. And this chili tasted like fecal matter. And I said to my husband, either I'm eating fecal matter and chili, or I'm so dispirited that I think I'm eating fecal matter in chili. And in either case, I want to go home. So I went home and I didn't work for 4 or 5 months. In fact, I hardly left the house. I lay on the couch with a fireplace and a cup of tea and patted my old cat, Glessy. And I found when I read psychology, I felt worse about myself. I felt like traumatized. I felt depressed. I felt highly anxious. But when I read Buddhism, I felt better about myself because I realized when I read Buddhism that I was joining a worldwide community of sufferers and that suffering was natural and that there were ways to deal with suffering, to lessen it, and to have a richer, fuller life. So I started very seriously studying Buddhism, and now I'm in a wonderful Sangha, which is a very important part of studying Buddhism. And the story I tell in the book is very illustrative, I think, of how Buddhism has been helpful to me. So during the pandemic, I went to Sangha one day and I was filled with, I think it was just before like a holiday, Thanksgiving or something, and I wouldn't be seeing any of my children. I wouldn't be making a feast and setting a table and all the things I love to do for family holidays. Anyway, the story that day that we discussed was a story of Buddha and his followers sitting under a tree. And a man came running up and he was very distraught and he was pulling his hair and shouting, "Have you seen my cows? Have you seen my cows?" And Buddha and his followers think for a minute and think if they've seen any cows. And finally, they all shake their head no. And Buddha said, "I'm sorry, we haven't seen your cows." And the man runs off going, "I am ruined, I am ruined." And Buddha turns to his followers and says, "Aren't you grateful you have no cows?" Well, that was a very meaningful story for me because I was realizing that I had no cows either. That the only way I was going to deal with the life I had during the pandemic was to be grateful I had no cows and to detach further from results and to live in process and try to make that process as beautiful as I could.
That's beautiful. How speaking of process and writing for you, how is the process of writing for you? It was interesting in your memoir to read that you had been discouraged as a writer to be a writer, and that you had become a writer, as you said before, in your mid-40s. So how does that square up with your training as a therapist, your humanness, and the complexity and challenge of sitting in a room alone with your thoughts and producing a book?
Well, you know, I wanted to be a writer when I was a little girl. I started reading very young. I loved books. I was extremely romantic about writers. I had this idea that I would live in New York City in an apartment and I would eat shrimp cocktails and no editors and go to poetry readings. And I was very romantic about all that. But I told my dad I wanted to be a writer. And he said, "No, you can't be a writer." He said, "You can't make a living at it." And both he and in fairness to my father, both he and my mother had almost starved during the Depression. They came out of great poverty. And so his thinking, be a doctor like your mother, was very realistic. He said, there'll always be sick people. Be a doctor like your mother, and you'll always have food. So that was one very discouraging lecture. And then at the same time, our teacher assigned us to write a sonnet at school. I think I was in 4th grade. And this teacher, I wrote a sonnet comparing life to the seasons. Spring was childhood, winter was old age, and such. And the teacher gave me a C and wrote in red ink, "Trite," at the top of my poem. Well, of course, it is trite, but it wasn't trite to me. I just invented that idea myself, I thought. And between that teacher's C and trite, and my dad's remarks, I just gave up on myself. And I never wrote creatively in college. I never took writing classes. I took pre-med, as my parents insisted I take. And then in psychology, of course, you learn to write as an academic, which is the worst possible way to write. You have no voice. You literally try to not even have a point of view almost. And it's this dull academic language that puts academics to sleep. I don't know how we've gotten into such a mess with academic writing. But anyway, when I was in my mid-40s, my youngest child had reached the point she didn't need a great deal of care. She could do things on her own, make her own cereal, read her own books, etc. And I decided, I've wanted to write since I was a little girl, and I'm going to write. I don't care if I'm good at it. I don't care if anybody ever reads it. I want to do it. And so I did it in just the most normal way other people do it. I took a writing class at the university. I bought 10 books on writing and read them, which has always been my way. If I'm interested in something, I read a whole bunch of books about it. And I started writing a certain number of hours a day. At first, there was no place for me to write. I'd write at the kitchen table, get up at 5. And then when the children needed woken up, I just move on my writing off the kitchen table, wake them up for breakfast. Later, I had a little room in our basement, sort of guest/trash room, and I'd write down there in the mornings. And eventually, I had my own study in a different house. And that was a very big step up for me. But from the beginning, I loved it. I loved the process of writing. Publishing, a little different matter. I've always worked for myself. I'd never worked for a corporation. I'd never had a job where the fate of other people financially depended on me. And I felt a great deal of responsibility, even though I've always had wonderful people to work with in publishing. It's not that. I just felt a responsibility to the publishers. That was very different when it was just to my own family financially. But I loved writing. I still love writing. And I don't know what I'll do next, Lisa, but I'm sure at some level I'll be writing because it's part of my life. It's a way to live life twice, once in real felt time and later in process reflected time. So it's a beautiful experience.
It's part of processing everything that we go through, back to what we were talking about at the beginning about selecting our narratives. Even if we're not publishing them, it's crafting the story. Let's talk before we run out of time, and I should have probably done this at the very beginning, about your mother.
Oh, yeah.
Such a strong influence. And I loved that she wasn't, you weren't paying an homage to your mother as this perfect woman. She was a deeply imperfect woman and a deeply accomplished woman, particularly for her generation, and how all of that obviously influenced you. So let's talk about her.
Well, of course, I loved my mother, like most people love their mothers if they're lucky. She was a wonderful person, and she was a great doctor. She was an extremely kind doctor. Nobody ever had to pay my mother. And she considered it her duty when we lived in my hometown of Beaver City to take care of everyone in the county. She's the only doctor in the county. So if someone got in an accident, she was out there with the sheriff helping patch the person up. If someone died, she was over there declaring them dead. If the football boys needed physicals, she gave them all their physicals. She did everything. She didn't have very many tools. She had a little pharmacy in her office, and I actually worked for her counting out pills. I sterilized gloves and syringes and medical equipment because back then they didn't use disposable equipment. Everything was sterilized. I remember the work very well. When she was with us, she was a very good mother. I believe she was on the autism spectrum for a variety of reasons. One is she didn't really like to be touched very much. She didn't like to be touched physically. She didn't make friends easily. She liked to be a doctor. And she was not someone who had much sense for attachment. For example, I write in the book about a year that my father came home from fighting in the Korean conflict. But my parents weren't getting along. And my family just divided up. And I went with my dad, who I didn't know, to the Ozarks to live in a trailer, my dad and one brother. And my other brother went to live with my grandparents. And that year without my mother almost did me in. But I don't think she probably realized quite how hard it would be for a 6-year-old girl to lose her mother for a year. I don't think she thought that way particularly. And so that was an interesting thing about her. She was also very tough. She saw patients who were dying. She saw a lot of suffering in her life. She was one of the first women in the Navy. She knew a lot of war stories. She'd seen a lot of suffering in World War II. And so when we children were growing up, she had very little use for complaints. And if we said, for example, we're bored, she'll say, well, I'll put you to work then. If we wanted to stay home from school, she'd say, well, let me get out the biggest syringe I can find and give you a shot of penicillin. I mean, she discouraged malingering to a fault. She also, it's funny as a doctor because she had little sympathy with people who came in to talk about psychological issues. She said she had no time for neurosis in her life. And so, of course, when I turned out to be a clinical psychologist, that was very surprising to her. But in spite of that, she was so kind. I mean, for example, one summer, I brought home the Summer Weekly Reader and said, I'd really like to get these books over this summer to read. So she said, of course, she got books from my brothers and me. But then she said, you know, I wonder if there's children whose parents can't afford these weekly readers. And she called the school and she said, let every children get the weekly reader this summer and I'll pay for it. So she was very generous like that. And when she'd leave, she left us children a lot alone. We were alone a lot as children. And when she'd leave, she'd say, be kind to each other. She was very oriented toward being kind. I never heard her say an unkind word to anyone ever in her life. And she only swore once in her life. That was when she slammed her thumb in a car door in Yellowstone. And she swore at my dad because he wasn't getting her medication soon enough for the pain. But that was just in a moment of pure pain and derangement. Yeah, I was very close to my mother. I was very influenced by her. And I was with her at the end. I was the one child in the Midwest who was with her at the end when she had a long and sad death.
Which you also paint very, very vividly and beautifully in your memoir. I wonder how much you understood as a young person, how incredibly unusual it was for a woman to have the profession, to have any profession, much less the profession of medicine that your mother did.
I did understand. I was awed by my mother. I had tremendous respect for her. And I kind of almost held her on a pedestal, like she was such a good person. I didn't think very much about whether she was meeting the needs of her children. I didn't think very much. I needed to believe she deeply loved us. And I needed to believe I was cared for my own psychological health. So I was very aware of that. The one time I remember thinking about her in terms of her parenting was people would say to my mother, they'd say, I don't know how you do it. You have 4 kids and you work, 80 hours a week. And I just don't know how you can manage it all. And I would be thinking to myself, well, she doesn't really manage it all. She's not home. She's not home for dinners and birthdays and school programs. And when we wake up in the morning, and she falls asleep in church and she falls asleep in school events if she manages to come. And it wasn't an angry statement. It was just an awareness that they must have been assuming she was a more present mother than she was, because she wasn't. She couldn't be. She worked all the time.
What is it now that the pandemic is winding down or shifting or morphing? What is it that you are eager to do more of And what is it that I think I can guess that because I know how important family and friends and your community are for you. And what is the message that you hope that you conveyed in this New York Times story? Are there other messages that you're hoping that will seep into our culture now that the pandemic is abating some and allowing us to get back out into the world?
Well, I totally agree with Freud, who said the purpose of life is love and work. And I would emphasize work for a minute. I think if we're capable, it's both our joy and responsibility to help the world. My grandmother taught me that. She said on her deathbed, she said, I asked her, "Are you happy? Are you happy, grandmother? Did you have a happy life?" She wouldn't even answer me. She just kind of snorted. And I repeated the question, and she said, "Mary, I don't think about my life that way. I think if I've been a good, useful person and left the world a better place than I found it." Now, I'm not totally of that philosophy. I want to have a good time. I want to be happy. And I've, been happy most of my adult life in terms of just having a pretty good time here in Nebraska where I live. On the other hand, I can't imagine in our very troubled world a life without work. And mostly what my work is local now. I still do some writing, like, for example, the New York Times op-ed, when I feel like I have something to say that's useful to more people than just my friends and family. But for example, one of the projects I'm involved with now is with two other couples from my Buddhist Sangha. We're resettling a large Afghan family. And that family in our community is connected to 50 other Afghans with the same last name. And they don't speak English. So it's been a very big project to help them figure out a way to live in America and find jobs and get a driver's license and buy a car and all the things that people need to do to survive in this country. The other thing, and I'm feeling it very strongly today because of the Supreme Court's decision this morning to limit the EPA, is I'm very engaged with environmental work in my state. And Nebraska is a difficult state to be an environmentalist. It's a very red state. We have almost no regulation in our state. It can feel like a hopeless place to work. But our environmental group was very lucky. And the first thing we took on was the Keystone XL pipeline, and we stopped it. We stopped that pipeline. And so we've had the experience that if we work hard and stay together and always, when we get together, we talk about actionable intelligence. What is there that we can use to decide our next plan of action? Then we go out and work. And then when we get together again, we report on our action, look at more actionable intelligence, and move on with more projects. So we're a very work-oriented team. We've become a beloved community. We're very close to each other as people. So I'll stay very involved with those two things and probably treat myself to some experiences in the life of the mind. I'm thinking of taking classes again. I'd love to take more history classes. If I had another lifetime, I'd be a historian. I love history. So that's in my future too, Lisa.
I think you've just given us a recipe for engaged aging as opposed to detaching as we age, which is, I think, what so many people do, especially after a lifetime of hard work for pay. Let's sit on the couch. But I think everything you've just said, if I were to repeat it, is exactly what we can do to feel more alive and present and useful as older people, which is something I hear so many people worry about.
Yeah. Well, I made a mental health argument for activism in my book, The Green Boat. I didn't say be an activist to be a good person. I said be an activist because it will cheer you up. Action is the antidote to despair.
I think that's a perfect place for us to end. I'm so grateful for your time and all your work, and thank you so much.
I really enjoyed this interview, Lisa. Thank you.
Super. And I hope, Ted, that you got what you needed.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much, Mary. It was an honor to host you at Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks to all of you who attended. A reminder, her book is A Life in Light, Meditations on Impermanence, and books with signed book plates are available for purchase in the link below and in the comments section. Go on gently.